Okay, welcome. Thank you, everybody. So I have 10 minutes, so I'll talk quickly. So by the way, I'm an economist, and people seem to think I just talk about money. But really what economists talk about is choices under scarcity. And I think there are lots of difficult choices that people make at the end of life. A lot of them cost a lot of money, but generally speaking, money is only part of what we think about. So let me ask a question first. What is a good death to you? Now, I suspect all of us can think about that. And in fact, one of the things I said to Richard earlier is I suspect there's a lot of disagreement amongst all of us about the answer to this question, and even really about the problem we're all trying to solve while we're here. In fact, it's still a little bit muddy to me. But putting that aside for a second, I hope in the last 15 seconds you've thought, okay, an answer to this question. Now I will challenge you and say, you're probably wrong. And when I say you're wrong, what I mean is you're wrong from your future self's perspective. So when you come to the end of life, you will almost surely make choices that are inconsistent with the choices you made today. And in fact, there's a paper published in Science that I would encourage you to all take a read through, which basically did this. They asked people throughout their lives to say, do you think you've changed a lot in your life? And everybody said, yeah, I definitely changed a lot. And they said, do you think you'll change a lot in the future? And everybody said, no, now I know my true self. But they were wrong, right? And if you look at the choices that people make throughout life, it's certainly consistent with these types of things. And even at the end of life, if you think about the choices, and all of you know better than I, if you see patients, you'll see there's lots of changes going on. People make statements, they revisit those statements, they say they want something, then they want something else. And so don't assume that you know what you'll do when placed in a situation that's life-limiting, in a challenging situation like that. Now, you ever play Would You Rather? So bear with me for a second. Let's play a very morbid game of Would You Rather. This is what I tend to do. Here's the game, okay? So you're diagnosed with an advanced cancer. You can choose between scenario A or scenario B. Neither are particularly nice scenarios. Scenario A, you get this menu of moderate pain, you're a burden on caregivers, your survival is 10 months, costs you $20,000, you can ignore this. Or scenario B, which is different and cheaper, but you die in an institution, for example. So these are the choices that maybe you'll face at some point in your life. And you can think, we don't have time to go through this, but if we did, I would ask you, would you choose A or B? And I can tell you amongst the room, there'll be some disagreement, right? Some people don't want to die at home. Some people do. Some people like pain. Some people don't like pain. We won't go into that right now. But if I ask you enough of these questions, here's another one, I can start to predict with very good accuracy how you would trade off, say, being a burden on family for money or for extending your life or for other things that you value. And in fact, I've asked these studies both to general population people like us and to cancer patients and to caregivers. And what I can tell you is, at least in Singapore, what people tended to say is, I just want to die cheap. Let me die cheap, right? But in fact, in reality, when you ask cancer patients, they tend to say, well, I don't want to spend a lot of money. And you can see here that what they really think about as important is not extending life. It's some of these other things, but they spend a lot more money than the general population thinks they would. Now, that goes back to what I was just saying with the end of history illusion. We tend to underestimate what we would do when faced with a life-limiting situation and how much money we would pay to get some of the things that we value. That has implications for policy, which I won't go into, but let me show you something that I think is a little bit more illuminating. Oh, sorry, these are the patient values, much bigger. But when we start to ask the caregivers, so take a look at these numbers here. So you can see that for Singaporeans on the left, numbers are modest, much higher for patients. But what about when we ask caregivers? So here's a study that we published where we compared the values. And what you see is that caregivers' values for just about everything are much, much higher than they are for patients. And the implications are that you're likely to be overtreated if your caregivers are making decisions for you. And they're certainly likely to encourage you to overtreat. Although you can still see here that extending survival is not necessarily the primary objective of patients or caregivers, yet the healthcare system certainly dwells on that. And I'll get back to that point in a second. Now, let me just talk a little bit about doctors. And I'll give you a scenario, a little bit of a thought experiment. And I won't, basically in this particular study, we asked doctors to tell us would they recommend for life-extending treatment or would they recommend palliative care. And we gave them a bunch of scenarios. And here's a scenario. A 75-year-old with advanced illness, you might live 18 months with treatment, blah, blah, blah. There's different costs. Would you recommend life-extending treatment or would you not? Now, before I show you the answer to that scenario, and we did lots of scenarios, I just want to show you something that I think is pretty important. We asked patients in Singapore, if you were going to choose palliative care, but your doctor recommended life-extending care, would you switch? And basically, half of patients and 68% of caregivers said, for example, if you were going to get supportive care and your doctor said get dialysis, which actually is what we did here, people would switch. So the doctor's recommendation is very, very powerful, right? Now, getting back to Mr. Tan, in this example, the one that I showed, and I won't dwell on the example, but let me just make the point that in our scenario, 43% of physicians recommended life-extending treatment, and the rest recommended palliative care. And in all of the scenarios that we asked, we had significant disagreement. And so what that says is basically there's a lot of uncertainty involved in the clinical decisions that you're getting from your doctors. And if you get 4 or 5 or 6 second opinions, you'll get lots of different answers. Now this has problematic given what I just showed you is that the physician's recommendation weighs very heavy in your decisions, as well as the caregivers, and both of them tend to push for overtreatment, right? So I think these are you can see the data here, but the point is that if the system is encouraging overtreatment, it's very hard for a patient to say no. That's the challenge, right? And so what we find is that in the Western world, in the place like the NHS, is certainly where you take cost out of the equation, the system has very high incentives, the profit-seeking on behalf of the medical community, the pharma community, some of the for-profit entities involved, and whether or not the doctor has a motive to go for treatment via profits or because they don't want to give up. Very powerful. Now, I won't talk too much about the issues of hope and regret here, but the reality is hope is also very powerful. And you could hammer hope out of people and maybe get them to see things differently, but I would argue that's not a particularly good outcome either. And so I think there's a real trade-off between overtreatment and hope, and I think we're going to err on one of those two sides, either sucking the hope out of people, which I think is a pretty bad way to die, or recognizing that some level of overtreatment is okay. And I think this is something we have to think really hard about. Now, I will say regret is also a powerful emotion, especially on the part of caregivers, so they don't want to leave some potential life-extending treatment on the table if they could have actually given it to the patient. Now, the problem here, and I'll make this point, one of my last points, is that we think as a society that every new drug that comes to market offers benefit. But the reality is, because of these things, society might actually prefer that these things didn't come to market because they put patients and caregivers in a very uncomfortable situation where they feel like they have to offer these things. And so, you hear these statements that the US is subsidizing the rest of the world in terms of new drugs and medical technology, but the reality is, by doing so, you're creating all of these new technologies. NICE does this as well, and it actually is probably making people worse off because the reality is they would prefer that these things didn't exist so they didn't have to be put in these uncomfortable situations. Okay. So my big take, and I think this is not inconsistent with what we heard this morning, is that to the extent that we can demedicalize death, I think that's actually better for everybody. Now, that's not so easy to do, and I think that's a fair statement for the Western or the developed world. I think for the developing world, that is on such a low playing field as it is, some more medicalization probably is good, but certainly not to the extent that we've seen it here. So I will stop there, and hopefully there'll be some time for questions. Thank you.